Hi, I'm Josie Foss. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at the Institute. I want to thank you for coming to today's Lunch and Learn workshop, which is Academic Publishing and Insider's View. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that we are live streaming this, so if you could try and keep side conversations to a minimum, that would be great. And when it gets to Q&A, which is going to be a big part of the event, if you could wait for a microphone to come just so everybody can hear you. Today's panel has been organized for us by Princeton University Press, and it includes editors from Princeton University Press, Wiley and Basic books. They're going to give us a broad introduction to publishing and the publishing process. Our moderator today is Allison Collette. Allison is the editorial director for the sciences at Princeton University Press. She's going to introduce all the other panelists, but can you please join me in welcoming them to the Institute campus?
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for coming. I think I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. Just briefly, I wanted to mention two other PUP colleagues that are here. Our colleague Sarah Henning-Stout, who is a promotion manager for the sciences at the Press, and also Christy Henry, who is the director of Princeton University Press. Now I will pass it to the colleagues.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to introduce. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Introduce myself. I'm Eric Crahan. I'm the editorial director for the humanities and the history editor at Princeton University Press.
Hello, I'm Gillian Greeno. I'm an executive editor in the life and physical sciences in journals at Wiley.
Hi, I'm Eric Henney. I'm an editor at Basic Books. I work primarily in the sciences and a little in the social sciences. Prior to that, I was at Princeton University Press for just under 6 years.
And I'm Fred Appel. I'm currently at Princeton University Press. I'm an editor as well, and I acquire books in the humanities and social sciences, specifically in religious studies and also cultural anthropology.
Great, thank you. So I think what we're going to do is, I know everyone submitted some questions ahead of time, or some of you did, so we use those as sort of inspiration for some, some general topics we're going to go through, and we're going to pose different questions to the panelists here, and then of course we're going to leave time at the end for more questions from you all. So and I hope you enjoy. So I think just to get things started, the first topic is just the publishing landscape, to maybe orient everyone and give everyone some context. So just to start off, we'll start off I think with university presses and sort of what are university presses? Where do they fit in, and what makes them unique? So can bat that either over to Fred or Eric.
Sure, I can get started. So we are speaking about book publishing here,
right?
And I suppose it is important to differentiate what university presses do from their commercial counterparts. There are many things that university presses share with commercial book publishing houses. In many respects, we are structured in similar ways. All book publishers will have, separate departments for, sales, marketing, publicity, production, design, editorial. So, all book publishing houses do perform quite, similar functions. We have a bunch of acquiring editors here, or commissioning editors, as we're sometimes called. So we do often do many of the same things, but there are differences. And university presses are typically publishing books, largely, obviously, of an academic nature, and acquisition editors, in assessing potential new book projects, have to think about the potential academic intellectual contribution of the projects in question. And a good part of the way we do that is by curating a rigorous peer review process, where if we identify a project that we want to move forward with, and if our colleagues concur that this is indeed a good project to consider further, it's a fit with the publishing program of the University Press, we would then choose some select experts in the field and send either the complete manuscript or a prospectus with sample chapters out for peer review. So this is certainly a function that our colleagues and counterparts in commercial presses do not do, although they may, from time to time, consult with people in the academic world if they're publishing important books by academics, nonfiction books. I mean, Eric, do you want to add?
Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think the other thing to think about university presses, of course, is we're part of universities, right? So we're part of university culture, and largely we're governed by university faculty. I mean, different university presses are set up in different ways. Some report to the library, some report to different type of faculty boards and operate as departments. But I think that is one important, it's sort of steeped in university culture. And they're largely non-for-profit, which, I mean, they're almost all non-for-profit, which is very important. They're mission-driven organizations relative to, say, commercial publishers. There are scholarly publishers that are not university presses that are commercial, and they do have elements of peer review, and they do have some of the things that Fred described, but they might not necessarily be mission-driven, or they might not necessarily be governed and part of the university. So those are other sort of elements of what makes university presses distinct from commercial publishers or other academic publishers.
And on that note, maybe Gillian, you could say a little bit about how Wiley fits in to the publishing landscape, and then Eric, maybe you can also speak to how Basic fits in as well, so to have a sense of a STEM publisher and a commercial publisher.
Sure. Well, I think my colleagues in HSS at Wiley would be surprised to hear Wiley called a STEM publisher.
Okay.
We do
Point
publish
taken.
HSS books, yeah. But really, Wiley sees itself as a society publisher. We publish more journals on behalf of scholarly and learned societies than any other publisher. And I think that what we see is our goal, is our focus is to be a resource for our partners. Most of these societies are comprised of academics, and they're very busy, and they don't have time to keep on top of everything that's going on within the publishing landscape. So what Wiley does is, it's our job to be the publishing professional, to keep up with everything that's going on, all the disruptors, if I may use that term, and to feed this information back to our partners. Because of Wiley's size, we also often have a seat at the table when government entities or funders are talking about policies, and so we try to advocate on behalf of our societies.
Yeah, and so I should say right off the bat that Basic is a little bit peculiar in the realm of commercial and trade publishers, so I'll try to speak a little bit broadly. As everyone's mentioned, the point of a trade publisher, of a commercial publisher, is to publish books with a commercial value. Basic is part of the Hachette Book Group, which is one of the big 5 commercial publishers, along with Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, so on. And they're all, private companies. And so the point is to turn a profit, right? And so those publishers are trying to publish books that they think will reach a wide audience, that will sell lots of copies. And they do that in a variety of different ways. One other thing that I would mention is at a university press, and I think that my colleagues here would agree, the editor that you work with tends to work in a fairly narrowly construed remit. They tend to be the sort of lord of their own little publishing fiefdom, whether that be about philosophy or physics or whatever. In commercial presses, editors tend to be much more generalist. Some, like at Basic, will have specialties. Basic publishes exclusively serious nonfiction and primarily in the sciences, social sciences, and in history. And that's a little bit unusual. Most commercial publishers, if you were to work with someone at, say, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt or something like that, they're going to be interested in lots of different things. They might do fiction and nonfiction. They might do some serious nonfiction. They might do kind of light, frothy memoir. They're more motivated by trends and what they're personally interested in. And so the insight that editor will have and the knowledge of your field will kind of vary depending on that. And I would also, but again, I would say the biggest thing is that a commercial publisher like Basic is trying to publish books that have a strong public readership. And I think that that's probably the reason why you would want to publish with a publisher like Basic. Certainly our books are read by academics, and certainly they're not dumb books. But I think that the idea is that if you want a book that's going to pretty much just be interesting to your colleagues, you probably shouldn't publish it with a commercial publisher, because they're going to know lots of different things. They're going to have different interests and questions. than a public readership. You need to be able to frame your book in terms of something that might be interesting to someone who's not a colleague of yours.
I'd actually like to, I'm curious to find out from Eric and Gillian. I'd like to find out from Eric and Gillian about their author pools and how the author pool of a commercial press might differ from that of a university press. Because, I mean, from a university press perspective, it's not as if all of our authors are academics, card-carrying academics. I mean, sometimes we will publish certain types of journalists and other people, but because of the necessity of peer review and because of how we are structured and what our mission is, the vast majority of our authors are academics at various levels of their career. So,
You want to go ahead and I'll...
Sure. Well, all of our journals that we publish are peer-reviewed as well, so the vast majority of our authors are academics. However, there are some practitioners.
So again, Basic is a little bit peculiar here. Most of our authors are academics. Every now and then we'll publish a journalist. Usually they're journalists that we could that have some sort of demonstrable expertise in their subject. But most of the time we're publishing working academics. And I think that that's not necessarily the case at other commercial publishers. It's true that a place like Basic even, or a place like Norton, which publishes a lot of commercial nonfiction that's sort of similar to Basic books, they don't do peer review. And so that does mean that the books that you'll see can sometimes be a little bit different, I think, and this might be like I don't know, you might all fight me on it. I think that when you see books that tend to go out on a limb more, chances are decent that they didn't come through a university press or didn't come through a rigorous peer review system. That's just been my experience. But you do find, I think, that those academics who want to say something that might be a little bit polemical or heterodox or whatever, that they think might have a challenge in peer review, you tend not to see those as much, I think, in the university press. And then you tend to see them at a commercial publisher, which isn't to say that they're bad or crackpot or whatever. Because I don't think that's true. I don't think we publish crackpots. And I think that it matters. No, and I think that, you know, at a place like Basic, which sort of prides itself on publishing credible and authoritative scholars, like what they do matters, their reputation matters, and so on and so forth. But Basic's most successful science book of all time is Doug Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach, which was like rejected by everyone and took a long time to get published, and even now is like 800 pages, super hard to understand. A lot of people don't finish it. Arguably a work of genius, probably wouldn't have passed peer review. And I think that that's something that kind of makes a commercial publisher.
No, that was all. And the only thing I would add that I think didn't come up in terms of range of books, I think, I mean, there's a big landscape of university presses from very small ones to larger ones such as PUP and even larger ones such as Oxford. University presses also, you might find a kind of a range of books from the, the monograph, which is meant for other scholars in the field, to often university presses now are publishing textbooks, particularly at an advanced undergraduate level to graduate level, such as we do, and then as well, sort of, the trade books or the serious nonfiction that can engage a popular audience. So we often say that we like to serve fields kind of across genres as well. But yeah, so I think, so the discussion of the publishing landscape is a nice segue to kind of the next topic, which is then, how do you choose a publisher, and then how do you approach a publisher once you have some sense of kind of the landscape. So maybe we'll bounce this over to Fred, but I mean, how should potential authors think about choosing a publisher? I mean, what are some of the considerations you might
That's a
point to?
good question, Allison. I've been thinking about that same question. Well, I guess you could begin by asking yourself, what have you been reading lately, professionally? I mean, what books have been really important to you in the course of your training and in your own academic career as graduate students, as beginning level scholars, as mid-career scholars? What books have really engaged you in your field, in your subfield, which books have been driving your discipline and posing the most important questions that have been pushing your fields forward. Which books have you been grappling with as you consider your current research topic or as you contemplate a new research program for yourself? You know, when before I entered into publishing, I did graduate work. I was a graduate student, and I confess to you, as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, I was really into books, and I was reading a lot of university press books and academic books, but I never really paid much attention to who was publishing what. I didn't really care about the names of the publishing houses. I was just interested in the ideas, in the authors, in the titles, in the topics. And, you know, who cares what the brand is on the spine? I mean, that was my view at the time. And, you know, I feel that a lot of my graduate student cohort felt the same way. I only really began to pay attention about this matter when I started thinking about book publishing, you know, in a professional way. And I encourage you to start thinking about who is publishing books, because it's sort of, I think it does behoove you to pay attention to the logo and the name on the spine. Who is publishing the books? Look at your personal library, you know, and look at the books that are on the syllabi of the courses that you took, that you're teaching now, and make a short list of the publishing houses that you find are really, you know, speaking to you, and the publishing houses that are publishing authors with whom you most want to be in conversation. And that could, you know, when you conduct that exercise, you could, you know, develop a short list or maybe a long list of, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 book publishing houses that you would most like to be associated with, that you would most like to contribute to. Each of those publishing houses will have a distinct personality. You could do further research in this regard. Many of you, I'm sure, go to annual academic meetings in your field, in your discipline. Typically at these meetings there are going to be you know, exhibit halls where the publishing houses will have stands or booths. They will display their wares. And in between the panels that you wish to attend and the receptions that you'll go to catch up with friends, you might want to spend some time doing a little bit of field research in those exhibit halls and checking out the exhibits and you know, schmoozing a little bit with the people in the booths and becoming acquainted with their latest releases. You could continue your research online on the websites of those publishing houses, and that can help you develop your short list of potential publishing homes for your book. In a little while, we'll talk about book proposals and what might go into a book proposal, but this initial research that you do, thinking about a potential publishing home for your book, will contribute eventually to that important section of your proposal in which you will make the case for why your book in particular ought to be placed with the publishing house you're approaching. Why is there a really great fit between your project and the publishing program of the press that you're targeting? Yeah, go ahead.
If I could just add one quick thing to it too. I think everything Fred says is right, and I would add that as you're looking at your bookshelf, take note of the books that have the same seal, over a period of years. Because I think that you will find that there are some publishers that will opt in for trends and will chase, for example, there's a lot of competition right now in the serious nonfiction market for science books. Everybody sort of saw that Neil deGrasse Tyson sold 5 zillion copies of his books, and so they want in. And there's a lot of interest in competition. And so you'll see a lot more science books coming out from different publishers. There are, however, various publishers who have been committed to, for example, science for a very long time. And I think that that's a substantive difference. I think that Princeton is a press like that. I think Basic is a press like that. Norton is a press like that. outside of science, you have publishers like Verso, who have a strong and I think very proven reputation for publishing voices on the left. Those are publishers that have like I think, predictable, solid, and dependable investment in those kinds of books. And from my perspective anyway, that makes it kind of a better bet if you're planning to invest a lot of time and energy into a book, to make sure that the press that you're signing with, first of all, knows how to sell those books, because different subjects sell to different types of people. And second, that they're probably going to be interested in it in like however many years it takes you to finish that book, right? We all like to think that we'll be able to get a book 18 months after contract, and that's like never true. Some books, you know, I know this is true at Princeton, some books at Basic have been under contract for like 20 years. And you want to make sure that...
I don't know if we should say that.
Well, which I would not say is admirable behavior, to be fair.
That's right.
But, and it could get you into hot water with some people. But it is to say that there is something good about thinking about which publishers truly care about the subjects that they're publishing in, and which are sort of interested, you know, kind of like lightning bugs are.
Can I add just
Please.
two quick points on that? One is just because a publisher has published in a field, this is the other side, does not necessarily mean they still are interested in a field. And that's equally, I've had frequently people who have cited books that Princeton has published 20, 30, 40 years ago as evidence of that we are a good publishing house for them, and this is not, it's an area that we have moved on. Is this all?
Keep going. You just lean in.
Yeah, so that's, and the other thing is think about, kind of just to follow on Eric's point, it also means that when a publisher is interested in an area, active area, it means they are spending money and resources in an area. It is a very practical way to think about that, their level of interest, which means they will not just interested in considering your book, but then also interested in marketing it and publicizing it and hopefully selling it as best that they can. So it's a whole other way to think about how you're evaluating publishers when you're researching them.
How does this, is there a kind of an analogous situation in the journal world in terms of people thinking about where they submit, you know, their articles, or does any of this resonate?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. You know, the most important thing when submitting a journal article is to think about fit. You can have written the most beautiful article, but if you've submitted it to the wrong journal, then, you know, it's no good. So, you know, when you're thinking about where to submit, what I would do is you look at the editorial board and the authors, see if you recognize the names of people who are publishing there or involved with the journal. If you do recognize them, that's probably a good sign. Another thing to consider is impact factor. You know, for some disciplines, you know, maybe the humanities, impact factor is not very important. For others, the sciences and some social sciences, it's extremely important. Another thing to consider is turnaround time, if you're time to publication. If you're up for tenure, but this journal has a backlog of 2 years, then probably submitting there is not going to help you with your case. And then finally, the last thing that I would consider when submitting an article somewhere is to think about fees. There's some fees involved sometimes with publishing an article in certain journals, whether it's a submission fee, color or page charges, or an open access fee. So if finances are a concern for you, then I would pay attention to those things.
And so once, so that going from sort of thinking about how you choose your publisher, then another question I think people were very curious about is then how do you actually approach said publisher once you think you've identified the right one or a handful of publishers that might be a good fit? You know, is there a right and wrong way to approach a publisher? Anyone want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think one important thing about approaching a publisher is we want to be found. You know, we're not just interested in selling our books, but also we want people to know who we are and what we're doing. So of course we're attending conferences, we're doing talks at places like this, and because we want to hear what you're working on. So I think probably, you know, there's no magic time, you know, to say like, I'm ready, let's go. I have a book and here, this is for you. But it is, I think as kind of Fred was getting at, it's good to go and visit and find out who's working in areas of publishers and what they're interested in, and to have small, you know, chit-chat, small conversations. I like to hear what people are working on, sometimes even if they're not a fully formed idea. I also like to help shape ideas. So it's sometimes, in these, in a conference, if someone has an idea and like, I'm thinking about this and I'm not quite sure what do you think of this? These are very fruitful conversations for me. Sometimes I might get a better idea, and sometimes that can lead to a longer conversation. When you think about, though, like the formal process of publishing, and for university presses, we're talking about evaluation and peer review. Really, the best time is when you have that idea, what your book will look like. In your mind's eye, this is the book I'm going to write, and then putting this into a proposal, and then sending it to the people that you've been engaging with. And it doesn't necessarily mean that's the book that it's going to be, and that doesn't mean that's a book it's going to write. It's the start of a formal conversation and a formal process, but that's really the best time to start a sort of more formal conversation.
Yes. Oh, anyone want to add to that? And I was going to.
I just wanted to add, just because I've been to a slew of academic conferences recently, as have many of you, I imagine, so it's fresh in my mind. Now, some scholars who attend these conferences develop the impression that unless they can get some face time with a particular editor to talk with them face-to-face about their project, unless they can do that, it's all over for them, and they won't have any opportunity to publish with that publisher. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Editors do want to be found, and we can be found not just at the actual meetings, but we do work all year round. And so if you are, for whatever reason, unable to develop to make a date, a rendezvous with an editor at a conference, all is not lost. We do take meetings at these conferences, and oftentimes our appointment calendars get booked up quite heavily, even weeks in advance before the meetings happen. So if somebody sends an email just a few days before an academic conference asking for a meeting to talk about their exciting book project, we may either be so overwhelmed that we can't respond to you in a timely manner, or we might respond to say that we just have no time available. But you shouldn't despair, in that eventuality. There might be a way of, connecting with that editor after the hubbub of the conference dies down.
Great. And Eric, I didn't know, maybe you could say a little bit about how you learn about books, and particularly the role of agents. I mean, I think even in the university press world, we also engage with literary agents, but it's, I think, safe to say it's more pronounced in the commercial world.
It is, for sure. At Princeton, there is, particularly in the sciences, I should say, Princeton works on, and a lot of university presses work on a strong commissioning model, which is actually something I think that is good about a place like Princeton. You have editors who are actively interested in the field, and they're going out and trying to meet people and figure out what needs to be written. That's the way that most of the projects come in. In commercial publishing, editors don't tend to do that as much. At some presses, you will still find it. Again, I think at Basic, editors do still go out and commission. Once you're at a place like Crown, although Crown is sort of something very different than it was, it's been sort of dissolved and then reformed over the last month or two. The editors don't really go out and commission. The agents come to them, and lots of agents come to them. So once you're in the sort of commercial publishing world, you have dozens of agents who are the ones who are going out and finding people to possibly write books, and they're helping them write a proposal, and then they're sending it to the editors who are in their Rolodex, who they think might like that book. And so those come through in a variety of different ways, but usually what happens is an agent sends a proposal to the editor's inbox. And it could take a few weeks before an editor actually gets to it, because after a while you'll get multiple per day. And it's the job of the editor and the editor's colleagues, and sometimes the editor's assistant, to figure out which of those books they want to actually pursue. So there is, I think, a growing trend in the publishing industry writ large toward commissioning, in part because, frankly, books are getting very, very expensive. And so a lot of people want their editors to go out and find books that they don't necessarily have to pay quite as much for. And commissioning is one way to do that. But nonetheless, it's more, I think it's really just sort of an issue of a sliding scale. At Princeton, you have some agents who come to you, but mainly you're doing commissioning. By the time you get to some of the really big commercial publishers, they're doing almost no commissioning, and they have lots of agents coming to them.
Yeah, so I think, right, so basically what we have is people out there, such as yourselves, writing books coming to us. We have the editors out there going to look for books, and then we have, third parties, agents, bringing them to us as well. And I think that kind of covers the...
Which I would also say, if you are interested in an agent, one thing that's really important, again, is to think about the fit. Mm-hmm. Because there are some every agent has things that they're interested in, things that they're not interested in. For some agents, that list is more specific than others. And sometimes that can be a real advantage. For example, the Brockman Agency is arguably the most famous and prestigious of the science agencies, right? They do pretty much only science books, and they represent some of the biggest names in science. And that's a real advantage for the people who sign up for them, because Brockman proposals get read by editors. Even if I think that the name coming in matters a lot, right? It signals that you can trust that it's probably a decent project. Even if it's not for you, it's probably still a credible project. There are some agents who will try to sell literally anything. And that means something, because that means something for their reputation. It means something about how seriously an editor will take that proposal when it comes in. You want an agent who's going to be honest with you, who's going to say, yes, this is a fit for me, or no, and yes, this is a good idea, or no, this is a bad idea, we have to do a different idea. And if your agent's only ever saying yes to you, then there's probably a good reason that you should find a different agent.
Great, right. So we can turn next to another topic of perennial interest, which is the book proposal. This is your first written presentation to the publisher. So, I mean, I think just a very general question is, well, maybe I'll throw this to you, what makes a good book proposal? And I think somebody in the audience, I thought, asked a really good question, too, of what's the difference between a good versus a great book proposal? So, do you want to start off?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us will have thoughts on that.
Yeah, what makes a good? Yeah, so let's start with the elements of a proposal.
Right.
So a proposal it's highly formulaic, and there's certain things that we're looking for. And if you go through all the publishers and agents, and if you look at all their guidelines for proposals, they're going to have the same elements over and over and over again. So it's worth sort of paying attention, because these are the things we need to know. Let's start with the really big ideas. What is your book about? Or the Seder question: how is your book different from every other book? This is usually best put in the very first sentence of the proposal. It is not always put in the very first sentence of the proposal. But I think the very tight summation of what your book is about, and the kind of overview summary, the abstract, a couple pages. That's this is a key element of every proposal. The second idea that I think is important in every proposal is, why is it significant? Why does it matter to whoever your imagined readership is? And we'll get to that in a second. The significance of your work can very rarely be, this is unique. No one's ever done this before. That might be true, and that's helpful to know. But for publishers we get nervous about unique sometimes, because we think of the model of who's going to read this and how is this recognizable to other people who read it. So you want to be careful, but you want to think of the significance. As a university press publisher, one of the things that this is my third point, the things we're interested in is the contribution. When you are engaging in a certain type of conversation, whether it's a disciplinary conversation, whether it's an academic conversation, whether it's a broader public conversation, we want to understand what you're contributing, what your book will contribute to that conversation. And this sometimes can be a reference to other books. This can be a reference to broader trends. There's all sorts of ways you can frame that. But that's an important, it could be everything from, I have uncovered this research archive that, I read 5 languages. No one's ever going to do this again. This is a contribution, versus to, I'm going to help, shape the nature of whatever, American democracy. Okay, so contribution is really important. These are kind of the big picture ideas. We also really need to know how your book is going to be organized. An annotated table of contents is very important. And it's not just it's not just the table of contents. The annotation is really how do you argue piece by piece. A long form of nonfiction really needs to be well organized, and it has to have a narrative structure that carries, that makes sense in pieces and through the whole. And so an annotated table of contents is really important. That was the fourth. The fifth is we need to know the problems or complications. What I mean is, how many pictures do you want? What's the art like? How many, what
Figures.
yeah, figures. Like these are important for us to know.
Long is the book?
How long is the book? Editors are obsessed with length. The reason is because it underlines every other decision we make, and that's why. And so we need to know these things. Lots of art means we have to handle lots of art. There's permissions, and and we need extra paper to print this art on. These are all things that we need to know right up front. And then, of course, I think the last point, which is really important, is we need to know when you are going to write it. And to get from that very abstract what your book is to the very detailed when you are going to write your book and how long it will be. And these are proposals, right? They're ideas. In some cases, some people are not very far along when they think about this. These are what I see as the sort of core elements of every proposal. And you'll see this across the board.
Great. So that's the core. Then what makes a proposal
Yeah, I
stand?
haven't got to that
Well, I'm
yet.
going to punt that one down the table. I think what makes a proposal stand out?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I have the right answer to that question, but I think as a general rule, if the author of the proposal can do as much of the work of the acquiring editor as possible, that would be great. And let me explain briefly what I mean by that. So when an editor at a university press, at least, looks through a proposal, that editor has a few things in mind. The editor has to, if the editor's interest is piqued by the proposal, the editor has to think that the project could be viably explained to colleagues and to the management of the press successfully and convincingly. The editor also has to think ahead to peer review, and the editor has to be able to imagine a successful path through peer review. Not that there's any guarantees, because peer review can sometimes be surprising, and unpredictable, as it should be. But you have to be able to see a path through to successful publication. So with respect to peer review, for instance, in the proposal, it's really important to make it very clear in the various sections, in the various rubrics, what scholarly audiences are you addressing, what your methodologies are, what types of scholarly readers are you targeting, because that gives the editor a sense of what sort of people ought to be approached to verify the scholarly credentials and excitement of the project in question. That's really important. It is difficult to know how to grapple, say, with a project about religion that comes from an economist. It's difficult to know. Sometimes it can be a puzzle to know what sorts of peer reviewers could successfully and usefully vet a proposal. So that's really important. And I also come back to the question of fit. The editor is also wondering, apart from the editor's judgment about the quality of the writing in the proposal or the inherent interest of the topic, the excitement of the research program, the editor also has to see what the fit would be with his or her publishing program at his or her publishing house. So why should this be a Cornell University Press book, or a University of North Carolina Press book, or a Princeton University Press book? Why is it for me? Why is it for my press? So the editor is posing these questions. If you can anticipate these questions and provide the response in the proposal, that's awesome.
Great. Eric, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think there are at least two big things, I think, that I want to see in a proposal fairly quickly. One, as Eric said, I want to be able to see that there is an idea here, that you have an argument to be made that is coherent, that is powerful, that is not obvious, that can be summed up still hopefully within a couple of sentences, right? I want to be able to know that this is a book that, ideally, any good nonfiction book is going to put some pressure on the worldview of the person who reads it. And I want to be able to know very quickly that that exists in your book, and that it can be sort of concisely summed up, because being able to concisely summarize a book is like key to getting it sold, essentially. And not just to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I think that that is how books kind of become important, is that they have like an identity that is determined by their idea, that means something. Second, I want some evidence that you have given thought to whether or not that's an interesting thing, right? Whether your argument is actually interesting to the audience that you're shooting for. A lot of that comes down to knowing whether you've thought specifically about comps. Editors and
Right.
publishers talk in the language of comps.
Right, and this is a good question, right? How do you research and articulate
Right.
who your book is for?
I think it's really important, and it's worth understanding how important it is, because like once a book gets acquired and it gets ingested into that publishing company's systems, the editor, who is your like biggest fan in the publishing house, who is going to be trying to ensure its success, has to convince everybody else around them to buy into the book, right? Has to convince their publisher why it's important. Has to convince the publicists what's interesting about it and why it deserves an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or something. Has to convince the sales force why they should really try to get Amazon to buy more than 20 copies of your book. And the way that they're going to do that is by saying that this book slots into or is in conversation with these kinds of books. Your book is the Thinking Fast and Slow of this, right? Or whatever. I understand that Thinking Fast and Slow is a pedestrian example for this audience, but it's also sold over 1 million copies, and so it gets comped a lot, right? One thing you see in a lot of serious nonfiction proposals is that my book is like Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Right.
And that's actually a red flag. I would encourage you not. Because not because everybody thinks it's a bad book, but it's because it almost certainly isn't, right? It almost certainly isn't going to be the next Gun, Germs, and Steel. That was an eccentricity of publishing, right? As a lot of successes are. What'd you say? Like Piketty. Like you know, we all would love if our book was the next Capital, right? Capitalism. It's like, so I just got off track. But my point is that you want to be able to say that you know what your book is and what conversation it fits into. And the best way to do that is to say that my book is like or not like these books. And if it's like those, then why does it deserve to be published still? And if it's not like those, then why is it close enough that it actually matters, right? You want to be able to say that it improves upon or destroys or whatever. And it has to be something kind of meaningful, I think.
Yeah, and in some cases it can be the first book on X
Right.
topic. Is there equivalent in journals of sort of this pitch that we're basically talking about? Or do you?
I don't really think that there is something quite similar now.
Right.
It's specific
Similarly
to
in
books. Yeah.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, so and I guess so we'll turn a little now to the publishing process itself. And so I mean, for a university press, of course, peer review is, and also of course for journals, peer review is a big central part of the publishing process. So I thought we'd talk a little about peer review and then also talk a little about the role of an editor, you know, what the people at this table do besides, you know, go out and look for books. So yeah, does anyone want to start with either of those topics?
Because it dovetails with something I was just saying, I'm happy to talk about the role of the editor.
Sure, go for it.
Which I think is summed up by saying that the editor is ideally supposed to be your number one fan, and the person who really likes your book and wants it to succeed, because that's really their job, is to help publish. You know, that's why they're paid by their publisher, right? Is to publish books that succeed. So your editor is going to basically be your shepherd through the whole process. They're going to, first of all, help you edit the book, help you develop it. Sometimes if a book is coming in just as a proposal, they're going to help you with structural issues, with argument, with tone, with level, especially if you're writing a public-facing book. At a certain point, you can't assume that your audience knows quantum field theory or something, and that needs to be negotiated. If the book comes in as a full manuscript, they're going to go over it with you and make sure that it's actually succeeding at what it's doing. Some editors get their hands deep into the machinery of a book. Some have more of a hands-off approach. And I think that it's probably important before you sign up with any particular editor to get a sense of how they work and whether that fits with what you want. Because some people want an editor who's going to be very interventionist, and some people feel very strongly that their book is its best possible version already, and that they don't want someone who's going to try to interfere with that. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that publishing is very complicated and not very obvious how it all works, or why you can or cannot do something, or why, for example, it takes months and months and months to publish a book once you've submitted it, and it can't just be printed next week. There are a lot of questions that come up as especially a first-time author about how publishing works, and your editor is supposed to be there to kind of help you negotiate all of this. Once your book gets put into production, your editor's still the point person. They're the ones coordinating with the production editor, with the copy editor, making sure that the decisions that are made along the way don't interfere with the success of the book, right? Don't compromise it in some way. Don't throw it off course if it's supposed to be published by the 75th anniversary of something, or by the conference where you're giving a plenary talk and you need it to be available or whatever. They're going to be the ones, as I said, who try to gin up interest among the sales team, right? Who try to get them really excited about that book so that they push it really hard with their accounts. They're going to be the ones that introduce you to the marketers and the publicists, whose job it is to figure out the little pieces of your book that they can mine and then display, right, to potential readers, to figure out how to package it. Throughout all of that, your editor is there sort of as your advocate to help you figure out these things. And so it is ideally a very close and productive partnership more than anything else.
Great. Gillian, and how would you describe the
My
role?
role?
Yeah,
Yeah.
in the journals world.
Sure. So journals editor, in terms of what I do, is a bit of a misnomer because, as Eric was saying, when you think of an editor, you think of someone reading and engaging with the content and maybe have their red pen out and they're correcting things. And none of that is what I do. I think that business manager might be more accurate. Basically, I'm the liaison between the publishing house and the society and the editors, the actual editors-in-chief and associate editors. I make sure that the journal's running smoothly, the finances, the marketing, the production, the journal's digital presence, all of that. So I very rarely actually interact with authors themselves. If I do, it's usually because something's gone wrong somewhere. So I have very few interactions with them, which is a testament to how well things usually do run. So very different.
Yeah.
Exactly. In the spirit of it, I think the shepherd, the metaphor I usually use is the Sherpa. Like your editor's your number one fan, is also the guide through the whole process, is a project manager, is a cheerleader. These are all sort of apt. The question we started with this is in the university press is the peer review process, which is of course, and I think as an editor at a university press, this is probably the thing I take among the most seriously because it impacts the project. It's basically the baseline of everything we publish. And the peer review process is kind of the harmony is the same at lots and lots and lots of places, which is we send out manuscripts, usually at least 2 reviewers, and ask for their advice on whether it is something worthy of publication in the terms that it is, whether for a discipline or for a certain audience, whether it's quality work, and we ask experts who can inform and comment on this for us. I think what's important about peer review, and kind of hits at what one of the things Fred said, is that when we're investing in a project, it's not really a gatekeeping process. It's really a conversation. It's trying to get us advice. It's trying to get you advice. It's trying to get the advisors, our faculty board, the people we work with advice that tells us what's the significance and contribution of a work, why should we publish it, what can we do to enhance it, and then it becomes a conversation. We almost always frequently give these reports to you and ask for your response and engagement with them so that we can learn from that and see what we're going to do to sort of improve the book. It helps our reputation. It helps your reputation. It basically makes better books. And this is true for journal articles too, which is and also, journals get peer reviewed. I mean, I think this is a significant element. And so what this, at the sort of heart of scholarly publishing, this is what we're doing. And it just is, it's not a like, we never put anything under peer review with the hopes of like, oh, we hope this goes away, or like, boy, this is going to be really hard, and we're gonna put this one through the ringer. What we're really trying to do is really buttress everyone's collective reputation and the quality of that work.
We want to enable the author write the best possible book he or she can. I mean, that's what really peer review is about. When I, as an editor at a university press, am getting ready to launch a peer review process of a complete draft manuscript or a prospectus with a draft chapter, say, I will often invite the prospective author to make suggestions of potentially suitable peer reviewers. I can never promise to follow those suggestions and to approach those very people identified by said author, but I would certainly take the suggestions quite seriously. I would typically tell the prospective author that I couldn't really approach someone who is a close personal friend of the author. A colleague of the author at the same institution is not a good idea either. Someone who had served on the author's dissertation committee, as Dr. Fata or something, or on the committee, not a good idea either. So apart from that, the field is quite open. I sometimes ask prospective authors if they can think of someone or two people to whom the manuscript ought not to be sent for whatever reason, to forward that name or those names to me, and perhaps to give me an indication as to why I ought not to approach that person. And it may not be a personal issue involved. It could be a serious methodological, disagreement. I mean, what one wants to do is curate a rigorous peer review process. Ideally, one wants to send the manuscript to scholars who, by and large, get what the author is doing, understand what the author is doing, and who might be invested in helping the author improve the project, rather than send the manuscript to a scholar who just thinks the whole methodological approach of the author is completely wrong-headed and who might be inclined to dismiss the project out of hand. The latter type of scholar typically would not be in a position to submit a constructive and helpful report of a manuscript. So one does not, one wants a rigorous process and a critical process and also a fair process.
So I'm going to pose just a very practical question to the group that everyone always asks. How long does all this take? And I know the answer is probably it varies, but anyone care to?
I can say, so you all can talk about the peer review process, which I do not have to do anymore. That usually adds a chunk of time. Once a book is, so we'll say this, it can take however long it takes for a book to become its truest self, right? For a book to finish, for you to write it and then get it to the point where your editor is satisfied with it. Sometimes that takes less than a year. Sometimes it takes multiple years and lots of drafts. That's very hard to predict. Once the book actually gets to that point where it can be accepted by production, it takes anywhere from 6 months if it's a short schedule to a year if it's a long schedule. And it can be, that time can be adjusted for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's a complicated book that is going to require a lot of detailed production, right? An art history book, for example, is very complicated and sometimes takes a long time. If a book needs to be out before the election season, then publishers will sometimes move mountains to do that. There needs to be a really compelling reason because a crashed schedule something that would be like 5 months or something is expensive and also risky. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that once you speed up the process, you introduce the possibility of more errors and carelessness. You also cut down the usual padding that is put in there for an author to turn around what is their portion of a production, which means reading over copy edits and then reading over proofs and things like that. There's usually a good amount of time in there to accommodate an author's busy schedule. Once you crash a production schedule, you zero out that time, and you as the author have to turn things around very quickly, and sometimes you can't, and that can be disastrous. And it means you can lose your place in line. Being able to stick to a schedule is important because, as everyone here can attest, there's a little bit of a printer crisis right now. There is a lot of demand for printing presses and not a lot of supply, and that's probably not going to go away soon because a little bit of insider baseball, printing companies are consolidating, and it's making things more difficult. So if you delay and you lose your place in line at the printer, it could mean another month or so before your book gets published. So that's all, I think, really important. The other thing is that, especially in the United States, to get good publicity for your book means that you need to have galleys, bound proofs of your book, months in advance, because there are lots of, I see the publicist in the room smiling. This is really important. People don't think about this because why would you? You've never had to deal with it before. But long lead publications, which tend to be the ones that you want to be published in, they want to see your book months.
You're talking about, when you say long lead, you're talking about newspapers.
Newspapers,
yeah,
magazines,
right.
Even if you want to go on a TV show, sometimes their schedules are booked months and months in advance. So they need to see your book well before it's actually published to be able to promote it like when it comes out. Sometimes it can be 5 months. Sometimes it doesn't have to be that long. But it's usually a few months out. So they're getting bound proofs of the book on which they're going to base all of their coverage. And if you shorten that time too much, you limit your opportunity to actually get that publicity around the time that the book is publishing, which is the most important thing. And those are just like a handful of the sort of invisible spacers that put time between you delivering the book and it coming out. It's very tempting to think that, well, you can just sort of like stick it in a printer and it should be done, but there's a lot that goes into actually turning it out.
And of course, in the journal, I mean, this must all, I guess, seem rather glacial. I mean, I don't know, in the journals world, of course, speed is
important.
Speed
yeah.
is
The most important.
Yeah.
In terms of publicizing articles, obviously at Wiley and any house that publishes journals, there are thousands of articles coming out every month, and there's no way to publicize all of them. If you think that you have an article that is truly of popular interest, then you can certainly petition someone at the house to do a press release for it. We do have in-house publicity departments. But I would say that actually the best thing you can do is to be your own publicist for articles. I would say put it on Twitter. That's probably the fastest way to get your content out there. Write a blog post about it, that sort of thing. So.
Perhaps we should say a word about the timing of the peer review process
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah, we should say a bit about that, and then we should move to questions. But
That can be a fraught issue, especially since, typically a university press will not be able to commit to publishing a project. They won't be able to offer a contract to a prospective author until peer review has been concluded. At the very least, a provisional peer review process, a review of a prospectus, say. And so I think it's important for the prospective author and the editor to come to an agreement about what the time frame should be. Authors should not be shy about asking, acquiring editor how long it typically takes, how long they expect it would take to get readers' reports on their material. And when the time is up, prospective authors who are waiting to hear back should not be shy about touching base with the editors to ask, how is it coming? Sometimes reports are late. It's invariably, acquisition editors are reaching out to scholars who are very busy, who have many demands on their time, teaching, administration, writing letters of recommendation. You all know about that. And they are also, out of the goodness of their hearts, offering their valuable time to help, to be referees in a peer review process, without which the whole machinery would break down in academic book publishing. So sometimes they will be overwhelmed and they will submit late. Editors will sometimes have to check in with them regularly to, hurry them up and to try to, haul in those readers' reports. You certainly have a right to a timely peer review process. Don't let an acquisitions editor keep your manuscript out for peer review for 6 months or 8 months. That's not okay. Don't be shy about insisting on a reasonable time frame.
Great. So I know there were a lot of, there were several people who asked about trends in the future and also related to things like open access. But I think what, looking at the time and everything, I think what would make sense now if we open it up to questions from all of you, and we're happy to field some of those questions in this block of time. So I think there are microphones available. So if anyone has questions.
Thank you. This is just a small technical question, I think, for our journals editor. You mentioned something about fees. My thought has always been that if a journal is trying to ask you for money, then it's a for-profit journal and not as reputable. Are there now not-for-profit scholarly journals that do ask you to contribute toward the cost of publication?
Absolutely, and there always have been. So, I think what you're talking about are predatory open access journals, and these are often journals that come out of India and the U.S. as well. And they'll basically publish anything as long as you pay them, a couple $1,000s. What I was referring to are submission fees, color and page charges. All of those are fees that are charged by, not-for-profit journals to keep the lights on at societies and whatnot. There are also, obviously, gold open access journals that charge article publication charges that are completely reputable. And if you have a question about whether a journal is reputable or not, you can go to the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is an online resource, and there's our rigorous standards that have to be met in order to be included in this directory.
Kind of following up on this question, also to Jillian. What do you think is the future of open access publishing, in particular with the European push for Plan S, for example?
Yes, well, I think that open access isn't a new thing. It's been around since the early 2000s, and we've sort of been gently working our way towards more and more open access. But there have definitely been some groups, specifically out of Europe, that think it's not happening fast enough. And so in early October of last year, Plan S was put forward, and I'm not sure if everyone knows what Plan S is.
Maybe you can say.
I could just define it for a minute. So Coalition S is a group of European institutional funders and some charitable organizations, and they put together a plan called Plan S, which is it's just a proposal right now. It's not a mandate yet, saying that the move towards open access has been going too slowly, and that as of January 1st, 2020, any authors that are funded by these, I believe it's now 14 funders and 2 charitable organizations, all in Europe, and then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well here in the US. Any people funded by these organizations will have to publish in gold open access journals or on open access platforms. And so, this is really, this is a big deal. This, sent a shock, I think, through the publishing community. And there's been some pushback on it, Some people say that this takes away from an author's right to publish where they want to, because, in fact, only 15% of journals right now are open access, which means that people who are funded by these organizations would not be able to publish in 85% of the journals out there. Secondly, what of the people who don't have funding at all? People in developing countries, people in certain disciplines, including the humanities and social sciences, who may not be able to pay these fees. One of the tenets of Plan S was that article processing charges would be capped, but they haven't talked about what the cap is. And I think the idea is that there are all these publishers out there making a lot of money off of the backs of authors. But in fact, society publishers are going to be affected by this as well, and so they're very concerned that they're not going to be able to stay in business if they're going to be losing a lot of their revenue, because for a lot of societies, journals are the heart blood, the lifeblood of their society. So as for what the future is, it's really hard to say. This is still just a proposal, and actually they're taking feedback on it. So if you are interested in having your voice be heard, there was a website you can go to, and you can write in and let people know what you think.
Thank you so much for this really helpful presentation. I'm a sociologist, and my question, I guess, is mainly targeted toward the PUP and Basic people, which is there's a lot of talk about crossover publishing. I'm a candidate for that. I left the Canadian magazine industry to become an academic, but I need a book for tenure, which has to have the university press trappings. But it's on climate change, housing movements, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So I'm curious, it seems that open access is like one of these categories that all kinds of people dump different sorts of ideas and aspirations into, and I'm curious, in practice, what does that tend to look like? What are the pitfalls of trying to do crossover publishing, and what are things to look for, either in terms of keeping it scholarly or making it fit both ends?
So do you mean crossover in terms of audience, or are you talking about open access as well?
Sorry, I said open access, but that was just a brain.
Oh, okay. But I assume you mean
trade
like
and specialist audiences, yeah.
Right, okay.
So I think it's important to distinguish between different ways the term crossover is used. Now, I've heard it used in several different ways. Sometimes one speaks of a crossover book in terms of a strictly scholarly book that could be of potential interest to scholars across a range of related disciplines. So a truly interdisciplinary book, a book by a political theorist of interest to people in Islamic studies, for instance, or what have you. But the other way I've heard it used is refers sort of on a broader scale, a book written by a scholar that crosses over into the world outside of academia, that will be read by non-specialists, even some educated, curious non-academics about a field. So I don't know what type of crossover book you're thinking of with respect to your own work, but it's important to initially at least get clear what we're talking about. The latter. Okay, and now I've forgotten your question.
So you were asking about what were the how to do that, or what were the trappings or things you should consider, or I can talk about all of these things.
Exactly what you said, and just my sense that people, the word gets used a lot, and I'm curious from the perspective of a press, something that crosses academic and also has some kind of trade appeal or non-specialist appeal, how you, as a press, try to approach that and what it means to publishers. So I think for a lot of academic authors, it's a very appealing category, but again, people mean different things by it.
Yeah, sorry. So I think the way to think about it is the audience for your book, right? And when we mean crossover, the latter definition I think is probably the best one. So leaving the mechanics aside, you have to have a very clear view of your audience. If you are writing a 10-year book based on a revised dissertation or something that has to satisfy professional requirements for a field, that can sometimes is a very different audience than potentially, bookstore shoppers or the media who are looking for, for interesting ideas to write about every day. And I think we hear about it a lot because people think it's a nice way to talk, oh, I have a great idea and it's going to reach a big audience. And then, of course, to get tenure, I really need a methodological theory chapter to really explain how this works. So when we think about, it's that clarification of audience and realizing that idea, those are at cross purposes. We at Princeton, we publish what we call crossover books for a general audience, but we spend a lot of time being very careful about really identifying, does that work? Yes, it's scholarly material, or maybe it's embedded in it emerges from scholarship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will satisfy the requirements sometimes of the community as being, of a discipline, or it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to reach out more broadly. This is a conversation to have with an editor, really, because when you're thinking about it, does it work? do you we think about this a lot. Does this really do what you imagine? Yeah, I think I'll say that. I think you'd be interested
Yeah.
about this. Yeah.
I mean, I think that a crossover book could do a few different things legitimately. And one of those would be that it is a book that brings some area of scholarship to a public audience, right? And so that is like, I, as an esteemed academic, I'm going to synthesize this sort of interesting research question that my field is all very interested in. We're going to do that for you. And a book like that could be like Robert Laughlin's A Different Universe, which was like a very valiant attempt at making condensed matter physics interesting to a public audience. Another way of doing it would be to publish a book that you think could at some point that could be used in courses. And so it ideally does something to synthesize a topic of research, maybe in an interesting way. For example, Basic published Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And that book has a very substantial trade market, but is used in courses all over. Another one, I think, which is a little bit more ambitious, but when it works is really beautiful, is when a person is able to make an argument about their field that has some sort of resonance to the concerns of public readership. And I think an example that is still bearing fruit is Pedro Domingo's The Master Algorithm, which is a trade book. Basic published that a couple of years ago. It's for non-specialists, but it's had some measurable impact on computer scientists. It's something that computer scientists teach. It's something they think about. It's done some work to essentially map out what a perfect learning algorithm would look like, what constraints it has, what it has to satisfy. That's a question that's interesting to people working in machine learning, who are all trying to figure out, right, how to make that perfect algorithm. But it's got obvious resonance for people who are just sort of interested in computer science and want to understand the future of computer science and artificial intelligence and stuff like that.
And I would say for university presses, it's perhaps that last category that, I think we perhaps touch on all of those, but I think particularly the last one where, we're often looking for the crossover book, trade book, that's going to, as much impact, perhaps thinking in the academy as much as educate the non-specialist.
What's amazing also is when a crossover book becomes a crossover book in spite of the fact that academics don't like it. And I think that one example of that would be Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, which academics like to quibble with, and I think they have totally valid reasons for doing so. But nonetheless, that book has actively contributed to the development of algorithmic fairness, algorithmic justice, as bona fide subjects in computer science. So that's been really interesting to see.
It does bear keeping in mind with respect to crossover books that a university press like Princeton has to send everything out for peer review, from the sort of the specialized cutting-edge scholarly monograph to the very broad crossover general interest book. And so even though the audience, even though the writer, the author may be writing the book with a non-specialist audience in mind, it does have to cut muster with the academic community in some respect.
My question is a more practical question. I'm interested in understanding in what ways does submitting a manuscript change, if it does, the way in which one should approach an editor, the proposal, the peer review process, and how can an author help his or her editor when they're submitting a manuscript?
Do you mean a whole manuscript?
Yes,
as
a whole.
opposed to
Yes,
as opposed to a prose?
yes, as against just a proposal with a few chapters, an entire complete manuscript.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, even if it doesn't happen as often, but if someone is submitting a whole finished manuscript, I still think it's very useful to provide the elements of a proposal. I mean, perhaps it might be abbreviated in some way, but I think that synthesis that a proposal provides, that looking, the big picture of what the book is about and the core of the argument, what Eric was talking about too, about can we, understand the book in a couple sentences, the audience. I think those dimensions are just as important to provide, even if it's already written.
And there's a practical element to it as well, which is that, frankly, I think you're probably going to get more attention from your editor if you can provide that, right? Because we get lots of submissions, and sometimes it takes sitting down with a manuscript and reading it over for a while to actually understand what it's doing, and to be able to synthesize it in a way that you could pitch it. And I think that if an editor sees a book that seems interesting or is by an interesting person, maybe they'll be able to sit down and do it, but it's probably less likely than if you could synthesize in a couple of paragraphs or a page or two at least to accompany your manuscript.
Right.
What it is that you're trying to do to hopefully entice them to actually take that time.
And another thing I might add, since you might want to emphasize in a letter, is kind of your willingness to change. I mean, sometimes if an editor gets a whole manuscript, they can sometimes be a little nervous that, okay, it's all written. Is this author going to be open to suggestions? So you might want to indicate your openness to feedback and change.
I also think it's helpful in a cover letter submitted with a book prospectus to make it clear whether or not you, as a prospective author, have also approached another university press simultaneously. It's important to be transparent about these things, and you shouldn't be shy about saying that. I'm sharing this prospectus with several other university presses, and I look forward to hearing from you. And if the editor you're addressing decides that he or she wants to pursue this project and move it towards peer review, that editor will want to have a discussion with you about the nature of your contact with the other university presses and whether that contact will continue during the peer review process at the editor's own publishing house.
Yeah, I have one practical and one more general question. So the practical question concerns the fact that many of us publish articles in journals, which will then later in revised form come up again as chapters in books. So the first question is there a kind of limit? I mean, that sounds too concrete, but is there a kind of guideline as to how many of the chapters could have been published in journal form, article form before? And in submitting the proposal, how important is it that you have the real chapter version as opposed to, say, well, this chapter is going to be based on that article I published. Here's the article for you to have a look at. So that's the practical question I have. The more general question is about commercial pressures on university presses and how they might affect your work. I mean, okay, these are not-for-profit enterprises, but I imagine that still when you look at a manuscript or look at a series or whatever, commercial considerations do play a role. I've also heard from authors sometimes that they were pressured into submitting a manuscript very quickly, more quickly maybe than was good for the manuscript, because the press did want to get it out because they thought this is the right time to do it, where, obviously for the reader and maybe sometimes for the author, it would have been good to, invest more time and work into it.
Eric, do you want to take one of those?
Yeah, I'll take. Can I pick? I'll take the first one. So frequently, this question comes up about how many journal articles potentially can be chapters in a book. Comes up all the time. I would say 99% of the chats, and the answer, almost in a way, comes to what I talked about with the crossover book, which is the nature of audience. When you write a journal article and submit it to a journal, you know who your audience is. You, in fact, could probably measure them. You could probably sit down at a computer here and figure out all the libraries that have that journal, and then who at those potential institutions would have accessed and read that journal. And so you could probably pretty quickly know who the universe of possibility is when you do that. So you have a very specific idea. The potential with a book is, of course, to change and redefine your audience. And so when you're when you're thinking about that, you want to make sure that you have that change in posture. Sometimes even, if you want to publish a book for your discipline that has, where you have a substantial number of journal articles published in journals that would also be read by that discipline, that can become a problem for an editor. I would say, what would be the justification for me to publish your book if a certain percentage of it has already been read by the potential audience for the book? I think on the other side, if you're looking to do more, and you're looking to change the audience, then my thinking of that starts to change, and then I start to ask, what kind of revisions are you doing, and how are you shifting this? And so there's no the idea of limit. I've heard people say 2 chapters. I've heard 3 chapters. I don't quite think about it that way. I think about how the justification and the audience it's going to reach, but it is really useful to this is completely normal, right? People say, I published this journal article and I'd like it to be chapter 2. I'd also encourage you to think to think about more laterally, especially this comes up a lot in revising dissertations, where people say, listen, I wrote my dissertation and chapter 2 is in this journal. Dissertations almost always have to be revised in some way or another to become books. And rather than thinking about chapter 2 becomes, that's going to be a journal article, there's so much material that's cut in dissertations, ancillary, tangential, lateral material. There's sometimes journal articles there that are not chapters, and that might be another way to think about how you're, moving your, revising your work as you're expanding it for other audiences. In the practical terms, it is great to get a sample chapter or writing sample with a proposal, even if it's, if you said, this is a journal article that I'm going to revise. I mean, I like having a sample of your writing, even if potentially, even if it's not audience, we're going to change at one point. So, so that's a very useful thing. That's a useful thing to have. And you can just say, like, this isn't going to be published. I'm going to revise it.
And the other part of the question was about, how we think about the commercial, what commercial pressures are we thinking about?
Can I answer this too? I like
Yeah.
it. Yeah. So I think about this a lot because just because, especially for university presses that are not for profit, we are commercial organizations and we exist in the same commercial world as Basic Books and commercial publishers. Now we make different choices about it, and we are sometimes willing to do things that are we are willing to, and it's part of our mission, in fact, to publish things where we won't necessarily have a large commercial advantage for them, but we are very much mindful. We have to keep the lights on. What we do costs money. We have, we are not for profit, but the old, we are not for loss either. We need to really try to, and when we have a book like, I think the one you were kind of referring to, where we're potentially maybe we see an opportunity in the market, or we see like, oh, if this book gets out at a certain period, we will. This will be great for us, and we will be able to sell copies. We are keen on selling copies, both because it's commercially successful, but also because we're measuring the impact of our ideas.
Right.
And selling copies is probably the easiest way for us to know that the books that we're publishing are being distributed, that people are that the ideas are having impact.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we think just as much and as deeply about market and audience as any other publisher. Now, what our thresholds might be are going to vary from genre to genre, but we think just as much about it as any publisher. I don't know, Eric, do you want to say anything about sort of the commercial pressures you all think of?
I would say, I mean, for whatever it's worth, even in the commercial space, publishers know that most of their books don't make money. Especially doing nonfiction. I mean, it's true of fiction too, I guess. Most books just don't make money. That's true. We can all sort of quibble with like the details of Pareto efficiency, but like most of the time, probably about like 20% of your books are going to be making most of your money. And that, I think that at Princeton and Harvard and Basic and Simon & Schuster, we have those similar kinds of acknowledgments. And also, the other side of it is that like a publisher like Basic might take on a book thinking that there's like a greater risk that they're going to lose money on it, but they'll publish it because they think that it should be important, right? Especially a publisher like Basic that has kind of a reputation that it wants to preserve, and that has a mission that it wants to preserve. Like, we'll take on books that we think may or may not actually make money. But there is always going to be some conversation about like, hopefully this will make money, and if it does, what do we reasonably expect it to make, right? And I think that like, and that's what I was kind of talking about when I was talking about comps too. publishers will buy your book even if they don't think it's going to sell as well as Jared Diamond's books, because most of them don't, and that's okay. And so it's better, I think, for you to be kind of honest about what the size of that market actually is, and then hopefully, if it's the right publisher, they'll be willing to take it on under those constraints.
Other questions? The gentleman over here.
Hi, two questions, one practical. So if you have a book proposal, and if you think your book fits very well in a book series, do you approach the series editors first, or do you approach the acquisition editor in the general areas first? That's the first practical question. If no one else has any questions, I'll ask a second, more general question. So I see some scholars always publish with one academic publisher throughout his or her career, and others, change publishers all the time. What are the pros and cons for both? So that's the second question. Thank you.
I mean, I could maybe address the latter
Sure.
Question first, then someone else could address the series editor the series question. So, I mean, I think one of the obvious advantages of maintaining a relationship with a particular publishing house and a particular editor is that you develop a good sense of how the publishing house works. You develop a productive working relationship with an editor. You have a certain set of expectations for them that will be met. They have expectations for you. Communication becomes easier over time, just as in any professional relationship that deepens over time in any industry. There are some obvious advantages. But each publishing house has a particular personality and has a particular profile and particular sets of strengths. If your work as a scholar is moving in a particular direction, and if you are working on a project in which your current publishing house is not a leading publisher, then it does behoove you to look around and to begin discussions with other publishing houses that might be able to, spotlight your book in a more advantageous way. And there's nothing wrong with having a serious and a frank conversation with your current acquisitions editor about this. I'm thinking about working on a new project. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if Princeton University Press is the right publishing house for it. What do you think? Here's my idea. Do you think we should, would this be a good fit for you? Do you have, and you can have a candid discussion. If you have a really healthy relationship, professional relationship with your acquisition editor, they're going to want the best for you and your work. They may want to make a case for retaining you as an author, or they might want to steer you in another direction, knowing that careers are long, and there might be yet another project further down the line which might be good to work on together. You might circle back and work with that same publishing house again sometime in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just different publishers are good at different things sometimes. And, like we just don't publish in certain areas and other places do. And I think that's if if you came to me and said, I have an introduction book and I don't know, just like something that's better suited for Pearson, I would suggest that maybe you should publish, that sounds like a textbook that maybe is just different. We just don't do that. Maybe you should talk to publishers that do that. I mean, I think that's just a good way to think about it.
Right. I think we think a lot about, right, is this a good fit? Is this the right home? And I think, as others have said, sort of that just open conversation about that.
Yeah.
And
on the series editor question, so many university presses and scholarly presses have series, and these are edited by academics, essentially substantive experts who help the editors of the press with a field. And the series have there's all sorts of different kinds of series. There are ones that are they're sort of umbrellas over topics, or there are series that have like a strong thesis, like are trying to make a case. In terms of approaching them, it's usually, if you have a relationship with that, my sense is if you have a relationship with that editor, the series editor, you should approach them.
Mm-hmm.
If you have one with the press, then you should approach the press. What you should do, and it's the same, if you want to submit it to me or you want to submit it to a series editor, you should just express interest in the series. And then that helps basically connect the dots in the background, and then we can have a conversation of whether or not that proposal fits in that series. So I think it's really if you have contacts, follow them, and if you don't, it's fine to write either.
Yeah, and I think it's a good idea to say, if you've already been in touch with the series editor and then you're approaching me as the editor, to say, oh, I've been in touch with the series editor, because I think as editors we'll pay attention to that, because we've chosen to partner with these people as editors. We trust, their judgment and what they think. So I think it's important to flag that as well.
Hi, can you hear me? This is just a comment question. I was thinking about the series, and I've published in series, that my perception of it is it tends to tie you more to the series editor than the press. And I don't know if that's a correct perception or not, but that's how I felt in my dealings with it. So you can comment or bypass it or whatever you want to say about that.
I have worked with lots of series in my career and lots of different series editors, and I would describe them as falling on a large spectrum of behavior. I have worked with series editors who I would describe as highly interventionist, involved in every detail, and they just really, they work with the author, they work with the manuscript, they're involved in the peer review. At the other end of the spectrum, I've had series editors where I've said, hey, I'd like to publish this in the series, and I get a sounds good. So I think that when you can talk about what that, what does that mean in the way of handling the book. I think what's helpful about using a series is, for me as an editor, as a great partner, a substantive partner, an expert in a field that I'm not an expert in any field. And so to have someone who's inside is really terrific. They're also a great marker. We say to the world, we publish in this area, and we are committed to this area, and so it's in marketing. It helps organize marketing. It helps organize a sort of a conversation. So it's another sort of tool of our publishing, not just working with an outside partner, but also really just helping getting conversation out of, we're interested in publishing this, and here's what we're doing. So it can be a whole range of different things. But I know I've worked with people who are. I'm not sure what series you're referring to, but I know I've been at both ends of it.
Since they haven't been addressed edited volumes, I wonder whether university presses feel that they're a thing of the past.
Whether the edited volume. Please comment.
Yes, exactly. Yes, for or against.
I mean, it is a very challenging genre of scholarly book, the edited volume, isn't it? A plurality of voices. There's no one sort of narrative through line to them. Volume editors heroically attempting to synthesize the main point of the edited volume in an introductory essay. It is a very different, and they can often be vexing to have peer reviewed, right? Because you have a multiplicity of voices, contributions. If you receive a reader's report on a manuscript that has been effectively co-authored by 12 people, the report might be quite mixed. Essays, chapters 2 and 3 are excellent. I would assign them to my students in a heartbeat. Chapter 4 is uneven. Chapter 5 is okay, but needs a lot of revision. Chapter 7, well, I don't know about Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is worth the price of admission. And so what does one do with a reader's report like that? A lot of the burden is placed on the poor volume editor or volume editors who have to negotiate revisions with contributors on the basis of these reports. And sometimes the contributors can be more senior than the people who are editing the volume. So it can get very tricky.
Yeah, and I would say also, at least in the sciences and science books, what I noticed too is that now a special issue of a journal can often serve the role that maybe an edited volume did in the past in book form. and they can serve a, can reach the audience, they can do so more quickly. So I think a question to ask is the book the right forum for this? Can you get these ideas out in a special issue of a journal, perhaps, that might cover this topic by multiple authors, and then use a book to do something that is particularly well suited to a book in terms of a single or co-authored argument that is really well suited to the book form. So I think that's a question to ask.
I'll be more practical. I think the commercial pressure on edited volumes is just significant, and the trend has been against them for some time. This does not mean that there are not successful edited volumes. It just means that they're very hard to publish, and so a lot of publishers have made lots of choices to choose not to do so. There are also different kinds of edited volumes. I think one of the questions that came up was the proliferation of handbooks.
Right, it's a great point.
The proliferation
There's
of
a distinction there.
And they're essentially edited collections recast in a different way. They have a different purpose, but they are very successful. And in fact, there are publishers who are doing a great deal of these. There's lots of edited collections. I would say there's far more supply than there is demand. Some work, most don't, but that's true of a lot of book publishing. But there are a lot, and I think what you're hearing is there are lots of trade-offs with them.
Anyone else? No? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.